Okay, like I said, my name is Brad. Traditionally, I started out, I went to school here. I was a graphic design and advertising major, but I somehow fell backwards into the web because I graduated in 2000. And anybody who knew anything about HTML found a job on the web. And so that's kind of how I fell into it. And over the last couple of years, I've started calling myself like a UX designer because I work more with users and sometimes Illustrator and whatnot. But to kind of really understand me and my personality, I think it's better to kind of explain some personality traits. So the first one is that I'm a creature of habit. I wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning without the help of an alarm clock. Then I head downstairs, I let the cat out, I pour myself a glass of water, and then I settle in front of my computer. That's where I check my email, usually Twitter. I have this like to-do list app where I check what I haven't done in the last day. I add anything that came into the email overnight. Then I let the cat back in, make myself breakfast, wash up, and get ready for the day. This is my routine. Like most people drink a ton of coffee, or they do different things, exercise to wake up. I have my like little routine that I have to do every morning. If I don't, the day gets really long and really short. I get all messed up. So I have a little girl at home, and so my wife says to me one day in the middle of my routine when I'm trying to wake up, hey, remember our daughter's having all her friends over this morning for a play date. And I'm freaking out. I work from home, I need to concentrate, and all that's going through my mind right now is I gotta get out. All these kids running around having the time of their lives, I'm not going to be able to concentrate. So my office is over here in Mentor, Ohio, and there's an office that I work out of over here in Rocky River. In between us, there's a city you've probably heard of called Cleveland. And like most major metropolitan areas, the traffic going across town, like at rush hour, is insane and crazy. Which brings me to the second thing you should know about me, which is I get bored really, really easily. And if I'm stuck in traffic, I'm not going to get angry, I'm not going to get frustrated. I'm not going to yell at anybody, I'm just going to be bored, and I hate to be bored. So I'm thinking, while I'm sitting here, getting ready to go, what can I do to keep myself entertained in the car? I don't want to listen to my music or whatever, so I have some options. I love books on tape. There's something like iTunes that's really expensive to buy a book on tape. Audible, I've subscribed to Audible before, a lot cheaper. You can download a book a month, it works pretty well, so I'm thinking about that, but then I remember something. The Cleveland Public Library has audiobooks for free on their website that anybody can download and burn to a CD or stick on your iPod, whatever. So I'm going to try this. I had tried it several years before when they rolled out the service. It was abysmal. It kind of sucked. It was really hard to use, but with any kind of software, when you roll it out, there's always going to be some bugs, and as time goes on, it's going to be better. It's been several years, so I was hoping it was better. I was wrong. It was terrible. In fact, it may have been worse. And so I did what I always do whenever I have like a really bad user experience on the web or anywhere. I made it into a comic strip. So I should probably take a minute and take a time out here and explain a little bit more about my career and the weirdness that it has been. Like I said, I'm a graphic designer, but I'm probably best known as an illustrator. I draw comics. I post them every week on my website. They also appear in .NET Magazine, which is like a front-end web design and development magazine, and every so often I get to do these cool things where I'll take semi-complicated ideas and I'll put them in comic format. So they're not necessarily meant to be funny, they're supposed to be like these long-form, informative comics. And a lot of people have been doing these. There's a guy named Scott McCloud who does these really, really well, who has inspired a lot of my work. So I get to do this stuff every so often too, but really what I get to wander around and talk about is my day job, which is like the web design, graphic design stuff. And right as this library experience is happening, I'm starting a new project. This is like it's going on 2 years. It was right before or right after the iPad was announced. So I'm really pumped. I've talked to anybody who I could get a hold of and told them I want to do an iPhone app. Like I hadn't designed one yet. And so someone got a hold of me and said, in Cleveland, and said, hey, we've got, and we want to start an iPad magazine. And this is like the day after the iPad was announced, so I'm pumped. Like this is like, as a designer, like this is where you want to be. You're going to be Art Directory magazine for this new device that no one has even played with yet. Since we didn't have our hands on an iPad, the very first thing we started with was the iPhone. You know, we're dealing with iOS here, so we're going to be able to translate a lot of the stuff that we're doing from one device to another. So this was Tactile. This was our first magazine out of the gate. And we really started thinking about magazines in general and books in general, and how are we going to take what everybody is familiar with in print and bring it into like this digital space, right? So how do we make a digital magazine better than a print magazine? And we looked at other mediums that have done this successfully. Music's a great example. If you had asked me 10, 15 years ago if you would ask anybody, like, what's the future of music, they would have said fidelity, fidelity, fidelity. It's going to sound like you're at a concert, like in the middle of this concert, the sound is going to be so much better than a CD, or in the middle of an orchestra pit. You know, it's going to be amazing sound, and it's going to surround you at all times, but that hasn't been the case. In fact, fidelity has gone down with MP3s. You know, we're streaming a lot of music right now, so the quality of the music isn't quite there. It's good enough. But what is there is that we can now like keep all these songs in our pocket. We can now stream these things. We can listen to any album anytime we want. Like that experience has like totally leapt over this idea of making the sound incrementally better over time. You can say the same thing about books. Reading a book on a Kindle, especially like one of the black and white Kindles, you know, the fidelity isn't there. It's not, it doesn't feel as good as a paper book, but it's so much easier to like keep all your books on there, to download a book immediately, not wait for it to be shipped to you or go to the store. So we were trying to think in that vein when we're thinking about magazines, like how do we make them incrementally better than what's out there? So we didn't have much to go off of, and one of the things we really leaned heavily on, because we didn't want to just design for the iPad, but we're also thinking about like all these other tablets that are going to come out. Like, what are we going to do? And so we had these like design guidelines that I'll go into later, possibly. I don't know, I haven't decided if I'm going to go into my list this thing or not. But all this really comes down to this question that I've always been asking in my career, which is, what is the secret to creating a great user experience? And so when we started the magazines, we started to figure out, okay, well, what do we think are great experiences? And we started to name them, and we started to say, what makes them great? But the problem with dissecting a really, really good user experience is a good user experience can be invisible. You know, if you sit down in a comfortable chair, you don't notice. If you sit down in an uncomfortable chair, you notice right away, or you notice after a while that it's an uncomfortable chair. It's kind of the same thing with user experiences. So we started studying bad user experiences, and we started asking people on the team, what's a bad experience that you've had, like using software? And I had a really good one right here with this comic strip that I made. So without further ado, I'm just going to run through this comic and just kind of, it explains the experience I had with the library. So step one, you have to find a book you're interested in. Step two, you add this book to your cart. Step three, you log in and check out your book. Step four, you get a download link. Step five, you have to boot up Windows, because I'm on a Mac and it requires Windows to run the software. So step six, I have to download some proprietary software. Step seven, I have to then install the software. 8, I get a cryptic error. Step 9, I have to Google the cryptic error because it's cryptic and that's just what you do. Step 10, I learned that I need an updated security certificate. So in order to get an updated security certificate, that requires me to open Windows Media Player, a totally different program. So then I download my new security certificate. Then I learned that I need to update my Windows Media Player because I don't use Windows that often, which of course means that I have to download and install it, reboot Windows. Now I can start up my Overdrive Media Player that I downloaded earlier. I get another cryptic message. I insert profanity. I give up on the library, open up BitTorrent, click download, and I enjoy my audiobook. So the crazy thing is, with all these steps here, is this was like, I had to condense the experience. I spent almost an hour that morning trying to get this to work, and I like to think I'm a pretty like tech-savvy guy. I couldn't get this book downloaded to my computer. So it all kind of starts with the website. I cut a lot of stuff out of the comic. Like, this is the page that the book is on. Like, I found this book. I want to download this book and listen to this book. What do I do? Where do I click? I mean, there's 800 links on this page. There's little icons. Maybe I click those, the PC, the Mac, Part 1, MP3 format, but I can't actually download this book because one of the links says, join the waiting list. Now, this is a problem I started running into a lot on the site because any book that's easy to find on the website has already been checked out. So you have these pages where you see, join the waiting list, join the waiting list, join the waiting list, join the waiting list, join the waiting list. Anything, like if they make a list that says, great books to read this winter, or anything that floats to the top of the category, it's already checked out. And this doesn't happen in a traditional library, because we're moving from what we're used to in a traditional format to digital. Here, if I see it, I can check it out. Online, if you can see it, you can't check it out. You can only join this waiting list. So here is a book that's available. And if I want to download this, I have to add it to a select list. And I didn't know what a select list was, so it was kind of confusing. So I decided to look it up in the dictionary. And so the Oxford English Dictionary defines a select list as, actually it doesn't, because it's not a real word. So this happens a lot. And once you guys kind of get out into the real world and start doing this a lot, there's a lot of terminology that we use when we're developing software, when we're building anything, where we start using this terminology over and over and over again, and if you're working on something for a year, by the end of that year, you are so familiar with all this terminology that you kind of forget that nobody else knows what a select list is. So it kind of seeps out, and regular users start seeing all this stuff over and over again. And it gets in their way because they don't understand our own terminology. And so this is all nitpicking, but that's kind of my point. You can get over terminology. Someone's going to figure it out. Okay, I know what a select list is now. I've used the site. They might get over the software crashing or cryptic error, but when you stack all these little things together up, when you start piling up all these little user experience issues, you get huge issues, and that's usually where software fails, where projects fail, where design fails, is these little issues start stacking up. So I made this comic strip, and I usually publish them on like Tuesday morning. Sometimes I publish them on Monday night, and that's what I did this particular day. And then I think I threw it online Monday night. I go to sleep. I wake up the next morning at 6 o'clock on the nose, about the whole 1 o'clock, and then I head downstairs, let the cat out, pour myself a glass of water, sit in front of my computer, check my email, Twitter, and that's when I noticed something. And this is cool. As a cartoonist, people on Twitter are talking about my comic that I posted the night before. Like, that is the best thing to wake up to see like people actually chatting about it. Now, I noticed as the morning went on that the amount of people who were talking about this, like, the noise level started to go up a little bit, and now I'm starting to get a little nervous about my comic. And I'm starting to think maybe I should have done this. And it's not really the problem with the comic itself that or the message that I was conveying or anything like that. Really the problem I had was the title. And the title was Why DRM Doesn't Work, or How to Download an Audiobook from the Cleveland Public Library. It's the word Cleveland that was bugging me because I love Cleveland. I've grown up in this area, and I love the city, and I love being in this area, and the tech community, and everything. So, and the people who really are hating on Cleveland aren't people outside of the city. It's really us internally, like, bashing on our own city, and I didn't want to be one of those guys. So I'm having regrets. And so I'm on Instant Messenger with one of my friends explaining these regrets, saying maybe I should change the title of this comic strip before it gets any bigger. And he said, you know, no, because by saying the Cleveland Public Library, it says this is an experience that you had. It's not like some strawman argument like you hate DRM and you just don't want to download stuff. This is like a real problem with digital rights management. And as he's explaining it, I thought, yeah, he's right. But not only that, but with Twitter, if you've ever had anything just kind of pop up and go a little bit viral, what ends up happening is it has a very, very short shelf life. These things like happen, and then 2 or 3 hours later, it's dead, it's over, everybody's seen it, and they've moved on to the next thing. And I realized at this point, it's been going on for an hour or so it's over, the flood is subsiding. So I was like, he's right, I'm gonna keep it that way. But what I was really worried about is Cleveland's a small town, and I didn't want anybody who worked at the library to think I was a jerk for like making fun of their website. Like, that's my big problem. So I'm like, it's over, we're good, so I just moved on with my life. But next thing I know is it got fireballed. And this guy's got a pretty popular website, and what's interesting is not so much the traffic he sends, but once he posts something, like it goes everywhere, like say Ars Technica, Boing Boing Lifehacker, like this thing is totally viral by the middle of the afternoon. And at this point, like, I'm feeling total guilt because I know someone at the Cleveland Public Library is going to see my comic, and they're gonna think I'm an asshole. I don't want them to think that. So I hold my breath, and sure enough, the next day, the Library Journal, which I don't know if it's a real magazine or just a web thing, but they did a story on my comic, and they actually contacted the library and asked them what they thought. So I'm just going to read this to you. This is the quote from the Cleveland Public Library. Both CPL and Overdrive, whose platform icon can be seen in one of the comics panels, told Library Journal that ever-increasing circulation shows that most people seem to be downloading from the library without any trouble. They don't care. They just don't care. It's like, hey, people are downloading. We don't care if they're having a bad experience. And that brought me back to this question that I keep asking over and over and over again, which is, what is that secret that you need to create a great user experience? And the real answer is that you have to care. And it seems pretty simple, but it's really not, because once you care about something, you put the energy into something, it takes a lot of time to really care about something. So a great example of this is another comic I did over the summer There's all this stuff that like newspaper websites do that drive me nuts, like auto-playing video, pop-up ad, and things like that. One of the newspapers I was picking on was the Denver Post. This is a huge pet peeve for me. Like, it's the internet. Like, the web exists because we have hyperlinks. And so if you're talking about something on the web, you should link to that thing that you're talking on the web. And newspaper sites don't do this very often. And so I called one of them out, the Denver Post. What I didn't notice was that they didn't actually write the story. It was written by Bob Tadici, who's a tech writer at the New York Times. The New York Times website, they have some kind of agreement where they actually get content from the New York Times. The New York Times website actually does have links all over it to this app and about other things. And what was interesting is when the comic ran, I heard from 3 people associated with the newspapers I was kind of making fun of. One was talking about how he puts SEO links in the middle of the content, which was kind of one of the points that I was making that annoyed me. The 2 other people were from the New York Times, which I didn't even show an image from the New York Times, who were defending their newspaper. And it just went to show that there's something about that culture. I didn't make fun of the New York Times because they actually do a pretty good job organizing their content and treating their content with like it has some kind of value. But it really goes to show that it's ingrained in their culture, that the writers care enough to like actually say, hey, that's not fair to this goofy little cartoonist in Cleveland. So another site, this is my favorite site, is really geared towards designers. It's called Dribbble. And the whole idea here is that you can post little screenshots of stuff I'm working on as you're working on it and see other people's stuff. It's really inspiring. When I first got my iPad, I of course went to log in and it threw an error at me. And it turns out that the iPad automatically capitalizes the first word in the sentence, and that happened to be my username. So it threw an error. So I just went back and changed that, and I logged right in, no problem. A couple days later, I go back on my iPad. I had to log in again. This time I'm remembering, don't capitalize the username. I didn't have to. It was already lowercase for me. So I went to my PC here, and I checked out the code. Sure enough, they added, you can kind of see it in yellow, it's a little light, but it says input, auto-capitalize equals off, autocorrect equals off. Man, it's such a little thing, but that just makes your experience that much better. And I've been in so many situations where I talk to clients and they're like, let's take this mobile initiative and do all this amazing stuff and let's build an app. But what I love about this site is they didn't really overthink the problem. They just said, you know what, there's 4 or 5 things we don't like about our website when we view it on a mobile browser, so let's just fix those couple things and move on. We can still do this mobile initiative and all this big stuff, but let's focus on these little things. Let's do these little things right. This is an app I use a lot. It's called Instapaper, and it takes stories, you can save them, and then you can pull them up through Instapaper. And I always have this habit when I'm on my phone, I do this thing where I'm on the couch and I'm reading it, and over time I start to slouch, and I get to about here, and the screen rotates on me, you know, it auto-rotates, and I immediately jerk it back. No, I've lost my place. When you do that, when it rotates and you rotate it really quick, this comes up. You want to turn the rotation off. I love that. Like, that is so awesome. And what I really love about this is that, like, you can't sell this feature. Like, this isn't something you can like put on your website and say, hey, we have auto rotation turn off feature. Nobody cares, nobody buys your software because you have features like that. But as a user of this software, man, I am totally sold on these guys. I love what they do, and I don't use the built-in like Mac iOS reader function that they added to iOS 5 because I really like Instapaper. I'm now a loyal Instapaper user because the people who built this really do care about the software they're building. This is another one. It's just this idea of paying attention to the context they're in. The Google Link Shortener. Press Command-C to copy if I'm on my Mac. If I'm on my mobile, it says long press to copy. It's kind of paying attention to where you're coming from and paying attention to those details. Here's another one. This is iRise, and it can take a while to download some content, especially if you're on a slower connection on your phone. So it gives you like a little game to play. But the reason I like this isn't so much the game you're playing, but it's like, I'm all done playing, thanks. When the download's completed, it doesn't automatically like kick you out of the game when you're about to win or anything like that. So we're thinking all about all this stuff and how we can add some of these details in the like magazine design phase. And we were fortunate that our iPhone magazine came out, and when the iPad launched, there were a couple magazines out there. Wired was one of them. And what we noticed is like we're of course wondering how is our competition like building magazines, and they're actually physically making JPEGs of each screen. Like they're designing it like you would design a normal magazine. You design it in InDesign, and then they export these things as images. And so if you've ever downloaded a magazine on your phone or on an iPad or anything, it's like a 500 meg download. The thing is huge. So it really got us thinking, like, you're designing for a 1024 by 768 screen. Like, it's designed for that screen. What happens when you, like, move it to an Android tablet that has a different orientation? Or the Kindle Fire is trying to push magazines now. Like, how? That's a smaller size. You know, you have to change all your content just for every device that you want to release for. And Android's kind of insane. I mean, it's kind of cool that it's open, but at the same time, you've got some insane resolutions here. Like, one of them is 320 by 201. Like, why not 200 by 201? You know, and then you've got other ones that are like, one is 153. 1537, and then you have a 1574, so you have all these, anybody can put whatever resolution they want on it. They are cleaning that up, but it just adds to the sense of chaos with the way that magazines are being kind of put out for these platforms. Not to mention the way that these guys are building it. They're designing it twice, because they're designing it for one orientation and then another. So that also adds to the size of the download. So we immediately knew, like, no, that's not what we want to do. This is a page from one of our sample magazines that we're putting together just to show potential clients. And we built it all in HTML. We thought we can do something that looks fairly good. But by using HTML, it's like it solves all those problems that we've always had on the web for the last 15, 16 years, because that's what it's built to do. It's built to, like, flex and move around, and as you change your orientation, it's very easy to do this kind of stuff. So this is where the presentation gets kind of interesting for me, because I've done this presentation many times before, but when Eli first contacted me, he said, hey, do you want to speak about responsive design? I don't know if you guys are familiar with that term, responsive web design. And I was like, well, maybe, but I don't have much stuff in it. So, like, this is like a choose your own adventure book. I can keep talking about visual design, like how to design stuff for the iPhone and iPad, and design patterns and things like that. Or I could just log off this presentation and do, like, the next 15, 20 minutes, actually show you guys how to code HTML and show you how to do, like, a responsive site. So any thoughts on that? Like, presentation, hands-on?
I say go hands-on.
Hands-on? It's cool, all right. Don't say anything more. So anyway, let me pull this over. So, first of all, do you guys, like, most of you are, I'm assuming you're, like, computer science people, right? How much do you guys learn about, like, HTML and CSS and actually styling stuff? Okay.
There's two special topic courses that go over it.
Okay.
They're not required. They're not required.
And the professor's coding style is frightening.
Oh, okay. Well, the good news is I personally think that HTML is way easier to learn than Ruby or .NET or PHP or whatever. So hopefully this won't be too bad. So this is my website. The new way of kind of handling this and how we're kind of handling the magazine stuff is we were building it to be responsive, and what that means, if I'm the mouse, is that my website's going to scale. See my links up top? Like, I'm building this so that it scales, so if you're viewing it on an iPad, it's going to look like this. If you're viewing it on a narrow iPad, it looks like this. See, like, I have two columns here, like my work column and then about me. But when I scale it down, one of those columns disappears and actually goes down there. And so it's all about building, like, your stuff so that it fits on whatever device that you want it to. So if you're on an iPhone, you're going to see something really narrow, but everything's going to fit pretty well, and it's going to scale dynamically. And the reason we wanted to build our magazines like this is because we didn't know what resolution future devices were going to be. They could be smaller, they could be bigger, you could be on a phone, you could be on a tablet. And if we just built it once, it would be really, really easy to port the content over to another platform. So we might be writing in Java to build the wrapper app that this content is sitting in if we were moving to Android, but we wouldn't have to rebuild all the content to resize a bunch of images. So I'm going to start with, like, an HTML 101. So this is what I'm going to work from. I'm not going to put in the header or anything. I'm just going to start with my, like, bare bones 2-column layout, and I'll run you through the code here. So here's my HTML. Up top, we got our head, which basically says, hey, this is an HTML document. And in that, we've got things like a title. Up here, we've got our style sheets, and you're probably a little familiar with that. You know, that just links to the HTML is where I put my words and my images, and my style sheet is when I say, hey, what color should I be, and where should I be on the page, and that kind of stuff. All that lives in the style sheet. All my content lives in my HTML. So then we have this tag that says end head. So basically what we're looking at is we start the head way up there, and anytime you end anything, you end it with a backslash head, or backslash whatever that tag is. So a good example is this H1, which stands for headline 1. So you start it with an H1, you end it with a backslash H1. H4 and H4, you know, H5 and H5. So that's HTML 101. You have these tags, they have some meaning, but they don't have any style until you apply style to them. So what I have in here is I have my body, and then I have a div, which is just a divider. Divider class is featured work. I called it featured work so I can identify it in my style sheet. And then I have another column, just further down the page, which is div class equals about. And to go back so you can see what this actually looks like. So this section is featured work, and this is about. So those are two different clumps within my HTML. They're kind of broken out into those divs. So that's HTML 1. And this is my style sheet. And this is how we make it look cool. So my background color is just black. So that's my body tag, which is basically your HTMLs in your body. I want to set all the fonts at Helvetica, set some margins. My background image is in there. And then we have our section. And our section is, see, here it is. Can you see up here? That's our section. And what that does is that surrounds all my content. And that's just the way I chose to build this page. So there's an invisible wrapper that kind of wraps all this. So what's happening in the CSS, it's on a wider monitor. Yeah. My margin is set to 0 auto. Now if we want to think about margins for a second, a margin is a margin. So if we have a box, and I set my margin to 20 pixels or something like that, that's how much space there's going to be above it. And how that works is it's, so how that's set is it doesn't have any pixels. So this is 0 pixels. This is auto, which means it's going to be centered. This is 0 pixels. This is auto. So what happens here is when we say 0 auto, when you only say 0 in auto, that means that the next, after auto, there's going to be another 0 and then another auto. It's just kind of shorthand. But basically what that is doing is that's centering that section on the page. It's putting it in the middle. Featured work, I set my width as 500. About, I set the width as 260. And how you do this with style sheets is this is how you position stuff. So float to the left. That means this is a column, and I'm floating it to the left side of the page. Within this section, so you have your section, which is a box. Then you have 2 boxes in that box. One box I'm going left, and this box is going to the right. And then I have my padding, which works kind of like margin, except a margin's on the outside of a box. Padding is on the inside of the box. So the padding here is set at 30, and it's set at 30 all around. So margin's outside, padding's inside. So that's kind of like, you add padding and margin together, and you add a couple background images, and you add some floating, and all of a sudden you've got everything you need to know to style the page. There's some quirks to it, but for the most part, I mean, that's the basic stuff. So really, and then here's this other stuff, like that H1, which stands for headline. I wanted to make it 30 pixels, and I added some margin and padding just to style it up a little bit. My H2, I made 18 pixels. H3, I made 22 pixels. So it's just going through here and sizing this stuff. So this is how a normal website is built. So I'll go to my website here. This is how like 99.9% of the sites on the web are today. So when I resize it, it breaks. And the reason being is because I've done all my width in pixels. Because once you set that pixel width, it's set. It doesn't matter what device they're on. That's the width it's going to be. So in the last year or so, we've seen this huge rise in something called responsive web design. And the whole idea behind responsive web design is what I was showing before. It doesn't matter what device you reach your site on, it's going to kind of flex and move based on the device size. So once you design it, you don't have to worry about, do I need a separate style sheet for the iPad, the iPhone, the Androids that are out there. I can just do it once, and it doesn't matter, as long as it looks good, as I resize my browser, it's going to look good on any device. So how do we do that? This is where I'm going to get my hands dirty a little bit. I'm going to use percentages. So, Photoshop. So here's an image of my site. This is a small screen, so you guys can't see my tools, so you're going to have to take my word for it. I always start out in Photoshop, mostly because I'm a designer, that's how I'm familiar with it. Some people just build directly in the HTML. I like starting in Photoshop, making things pretty first. So the first thing I want to know is, like, how wide is this column? And I think this column is 635 pixels wide. And that is in my HTML. So that featured work column, I said was like 635, but then I subtracted 60, and that number's not right. But take my word for it. If we take the width of that column and then we subtract that margin, it's 550. What we want to do, and the width of our page is 960. So what I want to do is I want to figure out what the percentage is of 550 of 960. So I'm going to pull up my calculator. Let's see, what is it? 550 divided by 960. Oh hell, what did I do? 50 divided by 960 is going to give me 57.29%. So instead of pixels, we're just going to use percent. Let me just say 59. Now what's interesting about this is what this is going to do is, even as our browser window shrinks, it's going to be 59% to its container. So it's not 59% of, so if you make it really wide, it'll take up 59% of the page. If you make it really small, it'll still take up 59% of the page. Whereas pixels are pixels. If it's 500 some pixels, it's going to be 500 pixels no matter what size your browser is. So that's going to help us flex. So I'm just going to save it real quick, and we'll see if that fixes anything. That makes it a little wider because my man's off. But
Yeah, it was 57.
oh, was it 57? Oh well. We'll get the idea. This will just be off. So what's happening here is you see how that now that column is starting to resize. But the other column, which is still set at pixels, that is not resizing. That's staying the same way. So we'll just quickly go in there and say, there's our about column, and we will say 260 divided by 960 is 27%. All right, so now we should have two nice little columns. But it's still breaking, and there's a couple reasons for that. The first reason is we can't just pay attention to the widths of the columns. Our padding is also set at 30 pixels. And since 30 pixels, that's also a standard size. So even though these are percentages, those pixels are going to throw out those percentages. So our 30 pixels have to be percentages too. So 30 divided by 960. Used to having a keyboard with my numbers over here, it's easy to divide, is 3.125. I'm going to do that on both. I'm going to close this because this is just going to All right, so now when we resize it, crossing fingers, all right, it's not going to break. Everything's percentages now, so this is going to resize all day. kind of looks like crap though. Partially because we don't really have that much room for 2 columns, so when you get them really small, it just looks kind of crushed. That brings us to another part of responsive web design. The first part is this like flexible grid that kind of can move with you. I should also point out one other thing. Is this section thing, I didn't set the width, it's set at max width. So imagine that like we had a larger desktop. That means that my width will stop at 960, and I usually only set your outer containers at a pixel width, but anything below 960 means the percentages will kick in. So there's a difference between max width and width. Let's see. Okay, so what I want to do is, on my website, I showed how, as I have my 2 columns here, as it gets smaller, one of the columns disappears, or it doesn't disappear, it kind of floats down. And we do that with something called media queries. There's CSS3, which is fairly new, and the browsers have been implementing it, has added these things called media queries, which are really pretty awesome. So get rid of that. And basically what's going on here is instead of, we're seeing featured work and about, and we have our 57.29%, we've got our 27%. And what this is saying, what's important here is it says at media. So anything that is 700 pixels, between 700 and 4,000 pixels, is going to be fed this information, which is 2 columns, with the 57 floating left, with a 27 floating right. Anything that is smaller, which is 300 pixels to 700 pixels, we're going to make it 100% wide, and my padding's still in pixels on that. But we're going to make it 100 pixels, 100% wide, and we're not going to float at all. We're just going to take the floats off. I don't think this is going to matter actually in this particular instance. I'm also going to take this out. All right. There we go. So we have 2 columns, and once we get to that magical 700 pixel mark, it breaks down, and it says, I'm not going to float anymore, and I'm going to be 100% wide. And so now you have taken your 2 columns and you've made like that. So that's pretty much it. That is responsive design in a nutshell. What it means for designers is it means a lot more math, and just as a general rule, designers hate math. But for the most part, it really does improve our sites, and it makes them more accessible by a lot of different devices and a lot of different ways. So, there's one other thing, is images. And this is actually, my images are set as pixels. If I wanted to set this as a percent instead, I could do the same exact thing. The main thing I want to show with this, though, is that you are when I was dividing before, I was dividing by 960 because my, what's this here? My main container for my whole page was 960 pixels. So when I factored in these 2 columns here, I was dividing by that 960. For the images are inside these containers. So this image, which is 200 pixels, it's inside a container which is like 550 pixels or something. So I'm not going to divide by 960 for this, because that would be too small, because it would be the percentage of this container. I need to divide this by its container. So you always divide the item by what's in its container. So that's 550 by 200. So 200 divided by 550. So that's about 36%. So what I'll do with this one is I'll just make it 32%. There we go. It shrunk a little bit, but you kind of get the idea. As we get bigger, it gets bigger. As it gets smaller, the image gets smaller too. And then once we get here, the container snaps to 100%, so that image gets bigger. But as we see it, it gets smaller and bigger, which is kind of nice because you're copying your images from kind of form to it. So that's it. That's responsive design in a nutshell, and that's pretty much all I got. So, question?
So we have one question about the image resizing.
Sure.
You're still serving this image that's still a larger size than what, yeah. Did you ever figure out a way around that?
No. A lot of smarter people than me have been talking about it. And what he's referring to is, if you think about it this way, my image, if I view it on a mobile browser, is like really, really tiny. Like you're seeing an image that's like this big, it's only like 40 pixels or so. But when I have it in that larger view, now we're talking about an image that's like 200 pixels. So you have to serve mobile users those larger images because they have to be viewed in two things. And that's kind of counterintuitive to mobile because you're usually on a slower connection. You're on 3G, something if you're lucky 4G, maybe even like an edge connection. So you're not getting something fast, but you have to serve up larger images to do this. And this really is one of like the downsides of responsive design. And people have come up with like little JavaScript quirks to say, if you're this size, we'll serve these images. If you're this size, we'll serve these images. I know people do that with background images a lot. Because in your style sheet, you can do that within your media queries. You could actually jump in here and say down here, I want to serve a smaller background image for a smaller screen size or something like that. But now, since it is kind of a new technique and people are still figuring out how to do it right now, there's a lot of big images going to a lot of small fonts.
So you're still figuring out best practices?
Mm-hmm.
As far as you as a design community?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and they're kind of always evolving. This whole idea of best practices, I think, kind of holds you back a lot of times because there's no right or wrong way to do anything. It's all relative to the situation you're in. You know.
Is IE still like one of those browsers that doesn't play well with other browsers?
Actually, no. IE9 is a really pretty good browser. It doesn't do all the CSS3 tricks, but for the most part it is. The problem is that we're still dealing with a lot of legacy stuff, IE7 and that kind of thing. So.
What kind of neat tricks have you come up with to make your stuff break well, I guess, for older?
I eyeball. So with my site, I think I had a couple different breakpoints. So back to a larger image here. So the thing to notice is like my navigation up here, it breaks after these columns. So I kind of got to a point where I thought the columns didn't look good after a certain point. Let me see if I can get to that point. And so I said, that's where I want to break. But my navigation actually still looked pretty good at that size. So I said, I'm going to keep my navigation there. Now I go down a little bit more and my navigation was terrible. So I decided to add a breakpoint there. Put my columns are there. So I just pretty much eyeball it, whatever looks good. I know some people have been using like, this is my iPad size, this is my iPhone size. And I don't think that's a bad way to do it, but you have no idea of what the sizes of devices will be 3 years from now. And so I kind of like just eyeballing it and saying, this is what looks good. I'm lucky, I don't have a lot of content, like content-heavy sites, newspaper sites, news sites, like that kind of stuff. That's a lot harder to break down because you don't know what your content is going to be. I knew exactly what my images were going to be and that kind of stuff before I started, which made it easier to kind of eyeball it ahead of time.
On that note, do you have any, because like you said, the content for like newspaper sites is a lot harder to do. I think part of that is also because they have to put an ads obviously on the sidebar and make other content. Is there any way that you can think of that you could do that responsibly? That would.
You can. I think some brave people are doing that. I don't have an internet connection, but there's a site called Smashing Magazine that just redesigned into a thing, and they have a ton of ads on their site. And they kind of took a ballsy approach where once you get to the iPhone side, they hide all the ads, which kind of surprised me. But yeah, I don't know of any ad networks that are serving up responsive things. I think how Smashing Magazine handled it is they said, we're going to make these columns flexible and responsive, but our ad column we're going to keep at a pixel width. And they just paid attention to how it was breaking down. And then at the smallest width, they just got rid of the ads.
How do you handle, do you have special code that you use to handle older browsers with like IE7?
Yeah, I think in this case, on my site, on my site, I actually just use the style sheet. So in this one, I actually have style sheet reset. Oh, here it is. If IE9 or lower, I pass it an Internet Explorer style sheet. And so basically what that does is it says, there's several things I'm using that IE just won't recognize. For example, each one of these links is just a list item, so it's like an unordered list. And I said, hey, take the first two and go this way, and take the second two and flow them this way. And that's something from CSS3, and so it wasn't going to recognize it in IE. So for IE, I have a special style sheet, which adds different stuff to fix that. I also add things like it can't, IE6 can't see PNGs properly, so that kind of stuff goes in the IE style sheet as well to kind of fix the transparency of PNGs. And I think that's it. I've used something called Modernizer, which helps out with that a little bit, but I don't think I'm using that here. It's like a JavaScript fix, and there's several, like DB Roundies is another one that'll help you out. And there's if you Google JavaScript IE fixes, there are about a dozen.
And related to that, when you were designing the style sheets for IE, did you ever stop and think, you know, this is really a hassle, or did you not have a problem with it?
You know, it's a double-edged sword. Because on one hand, it's a pain in the butt to do. On the other hand, it's job security. You know, because that's what makes being a front-end developer hard. Is all this other stuff that comes along with fixing it for IE and stuff like that. So I don't know. It's once you get used to it, you just know, like, as you're doing it, you're like, I know this is going to break in IE because I've done this a dozen times, and you know how it's going to respond. You just kind of get used to it over time. It just becomes kind of second nature. I think the hardest thing is really figuring out the breakpoints and just fiddling with the code constantly to make sure that it looks good at different resolutions and stuff. Yeah. Cool. That's all I got. Thank you, guys.